I actually add one thing that you did not have, and I don't think Nidra's still here, but we're actually one of the Accenture supplier diversity success stories. So 15 years ago, back in the States, Accenture actually did a mentor-protege program where they mentored Interos to help us get our very first government contract. And then fast forward 15 years ago, or 15 years later, they actually invested a couple $1 million into us based on where we are today. So big success story.
There you go. So Accenture, there's your case study.
There
right
you go.
Here as well.
A little bit of plug.
Bit of cross-pollination there. Okay, so we're going to dive into some questions here. And as usual, we will be doing a Q&A as well. So if anyone has any questions, please do throw your hand up later on. Really like to get you guys involved in the conversation here today as well. Now, so we're going to talk about the dreaded COVID word, and it's still relevant, of course, because even today, we've had some members of our team here at Bisceglie who are not attending and not presenting on stages because they've caught COVID and obviously at home isolating. So COVID was the catalyst for the current supply chain disruption, or one of the catalysts maybe. What should be the top of mind focus area for procurement leaders right now?
So it's a great question, and I think a little bit like the session I was on with you before lunch is really how do you harness the power of the data that's available in the world to preempt disruption? You know, to your point, COVID educated us that every company and every country in the world was really beholden to the strength of the business partnerships and the ecosystems they're a part of. And that's really, we throw a pretty wide definition when we talk about supply chain. So it's not just buyers and sellers, but again, we did a lot of work with the US federal government and multiple governments around the world. So who's investing in who's buying other companies, who's partnered with you. If you think about cyber attacks in the supply chain, they are up over 400% year over year. It's a massive situation, and it's because technology has forever underpinned and connected us globally. And then if you think about what's really big here in the UK and EU, we're all around sustainability and ESG, which the states haven't quite caught on to the same level. But you know, we're really beholden not just to get the right product to the right place at the right time for the right price, but our brand and reputation is tied to our supply chain. So when you think about what COVID did, as you mentioned, you know, my background's, I'm a logistician for 20 some years, started this company 18 years ago, always focused on that broader ecosystem conversation. And what COVID did was, for the first time ever, I can pretty much meet with any CEO of any company in the world because it has literally affected their price on the street. And that's really been the biggest shift.
Yeah, I completely get that. And, you know, while it's accelerated a great deal of the digital transformation and, you know, moved us forward at least a decade in terms of where we would have been, I do feel that it has put an extra spotlight on procurement as well and on supply chain.
Well, it has. And I think interestingly enough in what you just said, you know, I mentioned earlier we've been doing some surveys, as you do, just to understand what's happening in the market and making sure that you're satisfying the customer today and where they're going. But, you know, before COVID, before the pandemic, our biggest customer was the Chief Information Security Officer. Because if you think about cyber, it taught us that it's not the third party or the company you're buying from, it's who they're connected to, and the importance of continuous monitoring. And now the last 12 to 18 months, and I'd be interested if all you are seeing the same thing, it has been a radical shift to third-party risk management belongs to procurement. And just the rise, whether it's the first line of defense or offense, which however you'd like to phrase that, you know, there was a Gartner chart that is out in the public realm that talks about responsibility for third-party risk in the supply chain is 225% across the organization, because it's kind of nobody's job, but it's everybody's job. Yet procurement has become the winner, if you will, of really resilience in the supply chain. And I don't know everybody in the audience, and I'm not knocking any specific data provider, but it's not good enough anymore just to look at Dun & Bradstreet or Lexis, any single source, and just say, okay, I got a score and that's good. It's not. And so procurement's responsible, it's been elevated. And procurement is responsible, like I said, not just for the financial viability of the supply chain, but are we ethically sourcing? Are we doing well by doing good, right? And making also sure they might not have the cyber chops of the IT department, but they're partnered with them. And so it's really been squarely put in that world. Interestingly enough, though, even though the pandemic educated us in so many places, we're finding like a tenth of the corporations we talk to actually understand who is in their broader ecosystem. So the technology advancements are actually being projected over the next 12 months. And what we're seeing, having pretty much created a category around this concept of operational resilience of the supply chain, is that, 2019, I could walk into a customer and offer them a subscription to our platform, and they bought it, and it was pretty quick. Last year, I think the entire year, there were 60 RFPs for what we do. This year, the first 3 months of 2022, there were 80. I mean, the amount of purchasing of, to your point, the digitization of the supply chain and the investment in technology and the ownership and procurement is absolutely hockey stick growth this year.
And what do you put that down to?
So I think it's the value in the street, and I think it's that consumers are really holding brands responsible for the health of the supply chain. I think that, and this is a whole social media conversation as well, the newer demographic, the younger demographic, the brand loyalty is not where it used to be, just holistically, right? It's who's got an Instagram account or who has something on TikTok, right? What's in front of me right now? And this instantaneous gratification we are as a society, what's in front of me right now? So when I go to store shelves, I'm buying what's in front of me right now. It's not that I will go to 11 stores to find my favorite brand. It's I went to the store and I found a brand. And I think that consumers are, what can I get quick? What can I order from Amazon? It's Amazon Prime Days. What can I order off of Amazon? What shows up on my store shelf? How much do I want to pay for it? That's been a large part of it. And so you think about, you have a world that has been forever disrupted, right? Everybody's talking about, should we nearshore or reshore our supply chain? To me, that's just having alternative sources of supply. That's really all that comes down to. We built supply chains to be very short, very just in time back in the 90s, very lean. And we just got a shock to the system with the pandemic that said, well, that didn't work. And so how do we build agility back in? And that comes through data, it comes through listening to your customer, it comes through technology. And if you think about our customer, and I don't have brand loyalty, so how do I make sure that you have the product you need when you need it? The only way to do that is leveraging technology.
And you mentioned there, just in time, and there has been a lot of discussion about that. You're right. Do you think there is still a place for just in time when it comes to supply chain, or is it, just in case has been talked about as well when you're talking about nearshoring, or is it a mix?
Well, I think it's going to be a mix, and I think it depends on the industry. Just in case is really expensive, right? So it's very natural. Just think of us as humans, right? If I want to control it, I want to own it, right? I want to have it in my house. I want to have it in my warehouse. Again, we did that back in the 90s. Then third-party logistics became a big deal, so we started getting rid of all that and getting that off of our balance sheets because it was too expensive to own the trucks in the warehouses. And so I think you're going to have a mix. I mean, you have some industries that have, and this is really where I get boring at a cocktail party, but they have, sensors on the store shelves. So as soon as you buy something, the vendor knows that they need to provide something back there, right? The interesting thing I do think is happening is some of the revolutionary changes you do have in industries like automobile manufacturing, where you're going to be able to buy a car based on a subscription. And I think that that's just crazy interesting. And so I think there's going to be a mix, like just in case doesn't work in food, right? It goes bad. And so I think there's going to be a mix, but I do think this instantaneous gratification is really such a big driver.
Absolutely, completely agree. Are we in agreement there, by the way? Instant gratification is driving a lot of this?
So far, so good.
So
They're
far,
nodding.
so good. Yeah, no one's complaining or arguing. Okay, let's talk a little bit about compliance as well, because there's a lot happening on that front here in the EU, but also in the US as well. So if you look at things like the implementation of the German Supply Chain Act, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, and the Uyghur Forced Labour Prevention Act, procurement leaders are facing a barrage of compliance challenges right now. So how should leaders approach this new environment and one that's constantly changing? And sorry, there's 3 questions in one here. What should they expect further down the road?
Yeah. Well, I think the big thing to expect is they're going to keep on coming, right? I think that's a piece of it. I think a lot of this is pretty natural. I mean, if you think about the German Supply Chain Act or the EU Supply Chain Act or UFPLA in the States, which is all pretty much the same, not many of us, I hope nobody here, is going to argue that we shouldn't engage for modern slavery. I mean, that's like an easy thing for everybody to rally against. But I also think, and I've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of folks here, as well as in the States from the travel standpoint, is that businesses are rushing to start working together to get ahead of some of these policy changes because they do cost money. And so for those of us in the room that heard us talk earlier, I'm a big fan of understanding your business bottom line on what's going to ensure to protect profit margin, because that's what businesses do well, is they want to stay around, and you have to be profitable to stay around. At least you don't have to, I guess, but it's easier. And you want to make sure that you get a bit more predictable so that you can scale. And so I think that, you want to watch, where in the world, what geos are you doing business, in what industry. It's why mapping and monitoring your extended supply chain is so critically important. I had a phenomenal conversation with a government employee, and I say phenomenal because it was actually forward-leaning, which, not to knock anybody, but not always the situation. In that he's like, oh, I get it. If I get all my suppliers in your platform, now when any new compliance activity or, Russia invades Ukraine or pick your poison, I can now see what I need to do and make better informed decisions. And it was phenomenal. And that's exactly what our procurement leaders need to be thinking about, is that your job has changed. It's no longer good enough just to say, okay, I bought from that company because they had a score of X on that day. You need to look at what happened the day after you bought from them to make sure that you're still protecting your business, your brand, and your reputation.
Okay, and you mentioned there that, the importance of the bottom line with all of this when it comes to business. And obviously, globally, we're facing this tough economic times, increasing economic uncertainty as well, and, soaring inflation. So how should leaders... what steps does an organization need to take to mitigate that supply chain disruption when it comes to this financial crisis we're potentially heading into?
The first thing is it's a cultural shift. There really has to be an understanding about the knock-on effect of how you're doing business. And so none of us, and in fact, the woman who was up here was talking about sustainability, and I could have gone at Daniel for a while, but I think you have to realize, just look at sustainability. Nobody can be sustainable by themselves, but I thought you brought up a great example, right? Because that's the consumer driving the brand, right? I want to know that I should buy from you when I go to the store because you are packaged or not packaged in a specific way, because you're honoring that type of compliance. And so I think the first thing is every business, doesn't matter if you're small, medium, or large, you need to have a cultural shift that just says you are not operating isolated. You have to truly understand what's driving profitability, and it could be compliance. Again, it could be who you're partnered with or who you're not partnered with. And it doesn't matter if you're a procurement official of a private company or a public company. So in the public world, whereas call it 5 years ago, you'd have kind of a statement in your annual filings around supply chain risk. Now it's actually being audited and being paid attention to, and again, your brand is being valued out in the market. Interestingly enough, for the private sector companies, the procurement officials also are having to report. And we have several PE firms, private equity firms, that are using our platform to map and monitor their portfolio companies, not for even just who should they invest in or who should they not invest in. That's one piece of it. But the ongoing monitoring, because they want to build value in those portfolio companies. So should they decide to go public later, they want to get ahead of it. And the education, the person responsible in every one of those portfolio companies for the fact that they are being mapped and monitored always comes back to procurement.
Now, we hear a lot as well about, supply chains being difficult to secure or difficult to get that visibility into. Is it because they're just so complicated? Is that why it's so difficult?
When I started in supply chain 20-some years ago, nobody wanted to talk about it. I mean, it was all about trucks and warehouses. It wasn't sexy. It's not interesting at a cocktail party until, again, COVID hits, pandemic. I can't get what I need to get. I can't sell anything. Business comes to a crippling halt. And I think it's a bit existential until you actually realize, the good news, which is that data does exist, that there's a cultural shift happening across industries, that regulators are paying attention to it, so it's forcing not just the cultural shift, but the investment, and that there are ways to solve it. And so I think, it's been this, again, just storytelling. So we started with the US federal government many, many years ago. And I remember walking into one of the agencies, and they had just purchased routers, like Wi-Fi, like routers, off of eBay. And they were surprised that they were beaconing home to a country that... The interesting thing was that they had actually found the intel. The analysts had intel that said that this country was literally putting routers on eBay so that the US federal government would buy it. I mean, it was published, they knew it, and they still did it because the procurement folks at the time were being incentivized to buy cheap things. And so China knew, it was reported, and they still did it. Those things have changed. And I think that, it's no longer good enough not to know. There is no more black swans. These are not surprises, and there are methods and investments happening to fix those things.
You're absolutely right about supply chain as well. I mean, go back not too many years, even 3 or 4 years, nobody talked about supply chain.
No.
You might have a story in the news where it was a shortage of something in the short term, but supply chain was not in the lexicon at all. You didn't hear it on news broadcasts or in newspapers, and now it seems it's not in every story, but you go onto a popular news website now, and a lot of those lead stories are all about supply chain, which shows obviously the significance of it globally, but also the fact that it's become a major talking point. And like I say, as soon as the consumers realized that they couldn't walk into their local store and buy whatever product it was, suddenly it became existential.
Yeah, well, and my joke is my mother finally knows what I do for a living. I mean, for many years, she's like, oh, my daughter's in technology or whatever. And now, I would actually challenge you just about every day, right? You turn on the TV and there's something around the supply chain.
Okay, right, so a lot of talk about risks and issues. Let's talk about some solutions here. So can supply chain risk issues be solved? And if so, well, firstly, what are the solutions and what role does technology play in that?
Well, I think you can't do it without technology. And like I said, the feedback we're getting from the street is there's massive, so you heard us talk earlier, there's massive VC funding and PE funding in technology. But just about every company that we talk to, every C-suite that we talk to is investing. There's 4 different areas in supply chain technology that are all happening right now. The first is all around autonomous. So think, the labor shortage. Labor is a massive problem, whether you're trying to upskill within your organizations, because again, procurement officials have very different jobs today than they did. So even with that, I can't get people to unload trucks at ports, right? That's a lot of the backup. So how do I use drones or autonomous vehicles? So that's one of the things in the supply chain. The second is around simple logistics, right? So trucks and things like that. The third is where we fit. It's the transparency of the supply chain. I cannot be compliant. I cannot be compliant with German Supply Chain Act EU unless I map and monitor my supply chain. I just have to have that transparency. So that's the third area. And then the fourth is collaboration with the supplier themselves. And so, to your point, when people weren't talking about it, it was really a contractual thing. It was procurement and contracting, right? We have a contract with supplier, you fill out some paperwork, I check in with you next year this time, and did anything change? No, we're great. No longer is that good enough. And so the advent of continuous monitoring and the investment in that, and again, you can't continuously monitor without technology. And so I would challenge any of us to say, this is a big data problem, and the only way to solve all of it is the transparency of the supply chain is with the technology.
Okay, at this point, I'm going to reach out to the audience. Does anyone have any questions? If you do, if you just put a hand up, and we can bring a microphone out to you. Okay, I'll carry on with the questions in front of me. Oh, we do have a question there. If we can get a microphone across there, I'll just ask one more question while you're doing the lap of this huge, extensive Queen Elizabeth II Centre here in Westminster. So how do you think the procurement community dealt with the pandemic? Do you think they did a good job, a bad job, or could it have been better?
I think, in all fairness, I think most of us did the best we could with what we had, right? I think that procurement is not the first place I go for a technology investment. I think that so much, even today, well, maybe not today, maybe 12 months ago, the procurement officials that we were working with were still going to get budget for the chief information security officer because technology and security, that's where it was being funded. And so, I think you're starting to see those things change, but it's not really where you went to for a large amount of funding because part of, think about what you guys are, responsible for. It's efficiencies, cost cutting, like how do I get the best product in here at the right rate? It's very different when your brand and your price on the street are tied to the operation of that organization, and I think those things are changing.
Okay, so we'll take the question from the floor. If you can just start by stating your name and where you're from, please.
Sure. Rohit Burdeyar from VDART. My question is, what are procurement organizations doing to monitor Scope 3 emissions, especially with end-tier suppliers?
So it's a great question. And again, in this area of the world, you're a lot further about getting curious about this. And so maybe somebody else has different experience than I have. I'll start. I will tell you that most of our customers are struggling with Scope 1 and moving towards Scope 2. Scope 3, again, it's a bit existential, a little bit further out. And we still have folks, so much of this data doesn't exist, or they're still trying to cobble it together. But that's what we're seeing. Is anybody have a different answer? Didn't know you were being put on the spot, did you? No. Yeah, that's. Does your product solve that problem, or the person that asked the question? No. So, I mean, that's what we're seeing, is that we're trying to, and the other thing that's happening, to be honest with you, is that, who's auditing that and who's really being held accountable to it? I think when you start seeing those things, so much of when we think about, even in our platform, from a sustainability and ESG standpoint, we're in the mode of creating the data, right? So much of the data doesn't exist. And I think that's really the opportunity. Daniel was talking about it earlier as well. It's really the opportunity here, and I think you're going to see those things change as more compliance and regulations get implemented.
Well, along those lines, when it comes to compliance and regulation, do you think that is one of the main driving forces at play here, or is it also consumer demand?
I think if we're talking about from a sustainability ESG, I think those things go a little bit hand in hand, right? I'm gonna spend money where I can make money, and I'm also gonna spend money to prevent me from having to pay money, right? And so I think there's a little bit of both those things at the same time. But if I'm focused on profitability, I'm always gonna run towards customer demand, right? And so if the customer wants to see a good housekeeping, seal of approval, or think about like commercial real estate and LEED buildings, like I'm gonna run to where I can make money until the fines cost me so much more that it becomes punitive or it hurts my brand.
Okay, I've got one question that's come in here on the virtual app as well, so let's just address this one. How can blockchain technology help in mapping and monitoring supply chain?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think it's got a place. I mean, again, I've been around for a bit, and blockchain reminds me a bit of RFID back in the day, where it tells me it's a locating system, right? And if I even go back in the day more, which I hate to date myself, but EDI and advanced ship notices. And so I think it's just kind of the re-advent of that from having a ledger. I honestly, having done this for a very long time though, if you think about the world, in that it's very dynamic, and unless you actually own your your vertical manufacturing line. So it's a bit easier to think about agriculture or protein. We very often own the farm, own the fertilizer, own the protein, and potentially even the logistics that get that to the store shelves, depending on where you are. That's a little bit easier from a solid blockchain. Other than that, most companies have different profitability drivers, as we were talking about before, and if you don't own the business partners that you have in your supply chain, nothing gets you away from continuous monitoring. And so I think blockchain is useful in certain situations. Again, we deal a lot with governments around the world, and so if you think about the nuclear stockpile, right? If you want to be a supplier in any tier of the nuclear stockpile, very often you have to actually document your supply chain. And the people responsible for securing that will pay you more to make that not a dynamic situation because they want to control it, because it would be really bad if something went wrong. And that's a great use for blockchain. And there's a lot of those types of examples that I'm willing to pay for it, but around that, we have to allow for the dynamic aspect of business, which means any one of the players in your ecosystem may change how they do business in effort to ensure their profitability. And so blockchain doesn't always satisfy that. But I do think it's a play.
Okay, well, thank you for your questions, and thank you for the virtual audience as well. Another really great session. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Jennifer.